And they came, everyone whose heart was stirred, and everyone whose spirit was willing, and brought the Lord's offering to be used for the tent of meeting, and for all its service, and for the sacred vestments. So they came, both men and women. All who of a willing heart brought brooches and earrings, and signet rings and pendants, all sorts of gold objects, every one bringing an offering of gold to the Lord. And every one who possessed blue or purple or crimson yarn, or fine linen or goat's hair, or tanned ram skins or fine leather brought them. Every one who could make an offering of silver or bronze brought it as the Lord's offering, and every one who possessed acacia wood of any use in the work brought it. All the skillful women spun with their hands, and brought what they had spun in blue and purple and crimson yarns and fine linen. All the women whose hearts moved them to use their skill spun the goat's hair. And the leaders brought onyx stones and gems to be set in the ephod and breastpiece, and spices and oil for the light, and for the anointing oil, and for the fragrant incense. All the Israelite men and women whose hearts made them willing to bring anything for the work that the Lord had commanded by Moses to be done, brought it as a free will offering to the Lord. Here ends the reading.
Disappointing sometimes when we don't have a contemporary reading. I just didn't find one that spoke to what I was hearing in our passage for today. So I'm not disappointed, not at all disappointed, but means that I'll be steering things a little more command control than just floating through as I often do. So our story today comes from the story of building a sanctuary. It's just one moment in that building. We're in the book of Exodus, and Exodus is the second book of the Bible, and this is the book where the Israelites leave Egypt and they escape from slavery. And they have, at this point, they've made their way across the Red Sea. They've made their way to Mount Sinai. God has given the 10 Commandments to Moses. There's been a few other events that, if you've read it recently, you might remember. But now God has instructed Moses to tell the people to build a tabernacle, is our usual translated word. Tabernacle, tent of meeting, these are words that refer to the same place that the people create, the tabernacle. The tabernacle is interesting because there are more verses about the tabernacle in the first 5 books of the Bible than about any other thing or place or whatever. The tabernacle is very important. And the description is of a very ornate, very heavy tent, which scholars agree was written much later than the events portrayed. So if we follow the chronology of the Bible, these events at Sinai were at perhaps 1200 BC, and the writing is perhaps between 400 and 500 BC, so 700 years later. So we think that the description is not of an original portable place to gather, but rather something much later when they were settled and had access to many more fine things. It's an interesting thing, this tabernacle, because the tabernacle is going to become the place where God dwells, where people go to encounter God. And up until this point, God has been a terrifying entity, and the closest was at the top of Mount Sinai. So suddenly this terrifying presence is going to be living right there in a tent among them. So God was a transcendent, out of this world God, and now will be right here. We say that God was going to live in that tabernacle. Dwell is the word that's usually used, and it's not the same word that we use when people live someplace. So shakan means dwell or be in the tabernacle, and it's used about God, and yasav is the word for when humans live someplace. So they're clearly, well, God is in some ways like a person because God needs a house, a place to dwell. God is not like a person because God does it differently. So we're starting to get what we call an anthropomorphic description of God, understanding of God. And it reminds us that even in the most ancient times, most ancient ancestry of our tradition, God was not understood in one way. That God had many ways of being, many aspects. One of the challenges that we have in our church today is that the word God itself can be a problem, because as soon as we say God, for some of us, we imagine God on the top of Mount Sinai, or God walking in the Garden of Eden, or God telling Moses the 10 Commandments. We imagine God as a limited and an unlimited but somehow comprehensible being who speaks. And yet, for many of us, when we experience moments of what we would call the holy, it is, for most of us, I wouldn't say for all of us, because I know some of us have heard a sense of God speaking to them, but for most of us, it's a sense that there is something so far greater than ourselves that knits us all together, that connects us, that provides, here's a new word I learned this week, interstitium, the connecting tissue of everything. So it can be a problem word. It's a convenient word, and I do use it to the dismay of a few. But what this tabernacle signals to us is that there is something us that seeks, that yearns for, that hopes to encounter this interconnection, that hopes to encounter that. I mean, there's no single good word for it, so let's just say hopes to encounter that. So in this story, God has given precise instructions about how to build the tabernacle, materials, structure, where things should be placed, etc. Another way that we don't quite understand God in these days as dictating how we should do each thing. In our church, we are in a moment where not only do we not hear precise instructions from God given through Moses about how to be the church, but we're even looking at our own history and saying, how has the Community Church of Mill Valley been the church all these years, and which of those traditions and ways do we carry forward with us, and which are part of an earlier historical time? It's a little bit like the tabernacle that we have a description for is really a tabernacle for a much later time. The tabernacle that would have fit that earlier time was a very different structure. So our church, as we've been remembering, was founded in 1924 into 1925 by a group of people here in Mill Valley, some of whom were not affiliated with a particular church, and some of whom came from the Congregational Church, who said that they wanted to have a church where all Christians could come, regardless of their denomination or their creeds or their specific beliefs. And it was kind of understood in those days that most people were Christians. Most people had been raised in the Christian tradition, or their parents had been. Some of them had left churches because it was too rigid or too confining. And the intention was to create a church where everyone could feel welcome, could feel safe, could feel part of things, could feel like they belonged. Sounds a little bit like us today. We don't even ask you when you come if you consider yourself a Christian. Some people consider themselves Christians because they come from a Christian background. They've been to church. They know some songs and some prayers and some Bible passages, and they have absorbed an understanding of the teachings of Jesus, the ethical teachings of Jesus as a way of leading our lives. Some people come because they're wondering. They're wondering about religious tradition and spiritual tradition, and the Christian tradition is the one that's closest to them. Maybe they were baptized as children, or maybe they grew up in a family that went to church on Christmas and Easter. Some people come because they know somebody here and somehow got drawn in. And I've just given you a few ways, and I'm not going to tell you everybody's story because we'd be here all day. But we're in a time when, like the Israelites, we're kind of creating a new tabernacle, a new tent of meeting. And the word that has come down to us that talks about these kinds of places is sanctuary. We tend to call this room the sanctuary of the church. And I love that word because sanctuary means a safe place. It means a place where you can go while you're sorting things out. A place where you can go if you feel in some sort of danger, spiritual, social, interpersonal, political. You can come to a sanctuary. This is our intention. And you can know that you are in a safe place, that you will be welcomed, that you will not be judged, that you will be heard, that you can speak, and that you might hear something, whether it's the words of a song about running a race, or the words of a scripture passage or a sermon, or of a personal story that someone comes to share. You might hear something that connects to you deeply and says, yes, I want more of that. Sanctuary is an ancient tradition. We read about sanctuary cities in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. And we've had sanctuary movements in our own time. Churches have declared themselves sanctuaries, for example, for immigrants and refugees who are seeking to avoid deportation while they sort out what can happen for them. But a sanctuary is a place where there's a certain tension, because there's this seeking for that grand that, seeking that connection to the greater beingness that connects us all, that is so vast that we can't perceive it, that is so vast that every description is a wonderful metaphor and never can be the literal truth, if there were such a thing, which I don't believe in, by the way. But this connection to that, but it's also a connection right here. So in theology speak, we call it the transcendent and the immanent. We come here because we're hoping for both. We don't know which might come, if any. But for many of us, we experience that sanctuary, we experience that presence when we speak to each other and can look each other in the eyes and have that very human connection that conveys to us deep caring. For some of us, our sanctuaries are more in the wild. Our sanctuaries are out on a hiking trail or on a beach, on the top of a mountain, like Moses. Some of us have many sanctuaries. But I think part of our project is to find that capacity for sanctuary in ourselves so that we can also be our own sanctuaries when needed. As I've been thinking about our church this past week, I've been thinking about how we are in a moment of transition. We're a moment of transition from the COVID times to our new times. We're never going back to what we were before COVID. We will always have our Zoom connections and our friends and members and visitors who come to us via Zoom. We will always have people who can be with us because of Zoom, because it wouldn't be possible for them to come here on a Sunday morning and be with us. So we're never going back to the way we were. We're probably never going back to a board of directors of 9 members and a Christian life team of 7 and active subcommittees carrying out this and that. In fact, I see us as recreating how we work together. We have certain structures in place that will persist by our current bylaws at least, and by the understanding of a nonprofit organization. We have a board with officers, and they're responsible for overseeing the finances and the structures and the public presence of the church. We call it a Christian life team. For those of us who don't really like the word God, some of us don't even really like calling ourselves Christians because we don't quite know what our connection to the Christian tradition should be called. Clearly, the teachings of Jesus speak to us. The ethical teachings, the instructions to care for the hungry and house the homeless and welcome the stranger, care for the sick and visit those in prison. Clearly, those teachings speak to us. But the rest of the dogma that has come down to us, we are all in a different place. Annie was telling me this week that she's been reading things about Denmark, where she's from, which has a very communal approach to their common shared life as a nation. So as a nation, they believe that no one should be hungry, and no one should be homeless, and no one should lack medical care, and no one should be alone who doesn't choose to be alone, that there would be places that people can be together. Only they call it secularism. It's values that clearly come from the Christian tradition that shaped the Danish people most of the Danish people, not the Jewish people, not those who didn't adopt Christianity, not the Muslims and many other people who've been there and come there over the years. But they were able to agree even outside a church context on certain values that we would call Christian. And truth be told, if we look at almost any other religious tradition, they share those values. Now, how did I go in that direction? Because I was heading in a different direction. So let me pull myself back here. I've been thinking about how we do things. How do we do things? How do we make our decisions? When the church was formed in 1924, it was agreed, at least for the time being, to adopt the congregational model of how business and arrangements are conducted. And the congregational model is that every member has a vote and that you choose committees of people to carry things out because everybody can't be involved in everything, and that you trust your committees to make the right decisions, and that if some big decision comes up, you talk about it all together. We've continued that, and I expect that we will. Similarly, as we continue the original intention of the church to make a place where everybody could come, everyone in the community. But what kind of structures do we use? You know, in the United States, in most contexts, we have what you would call a top-down way of working. Someone at the top makes a decision and passes it down, a little bit like God telling Moses, who tells the Israelites what to do. But we have other ways too, and scientists among us, ecologists among us, have studied how ecosystems work, which is not a top-down situation. Even though they may have what ecologists call a top predator, the top predator is not in charge of that ecosystem. Each member of that ecosystem, each community within that ecosystem, each species, each niche, each pocket of existence operates in a certain way, which is we keep doing what worked before until it doesn't work, and then we try something else. And I think that's where we are. We've had a wonderful spring season where 6 new members have already joined us, 2 more will join us. In fact, let me just check. Would people like to join today, or shall we set aside a special day to join? Today for Katie. Jim, today's okay? All right. We'll have you join today. We'll do that during the sharing time. 8 new members. I can't tell you. I mean, I've said this. I'm not going to say it again. It's just a really transformative moment for us, right? It's a transformative moment. And it means that every gift that those of us who have been here since 19-something, up to those who have been here 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, to those who have been here a few months, each one of us has gifts that we give to the church and that we hope to give to the church. We want to know what those are. We want to talk together about that and sort out how are we going to conduct things in the future. So I like this idea of imagining ourselves as an ecosystem because it allows for difference one to the next, and at the same time, it expects collaboration and community and interaction, mutual sharing, listening. Much has been made in the United States of the idea that ecosystems, in fact, nature itself is competitive. But actually, only small elements of nature are competitive. Most collaborate, cooperate, live together. And so, if we need to compete, if we need to run a race, we'll do that. But if instead what makes sense for us is to build something together using whatever we have to bring, that is what we'll do. Just two more little words I'd like to share that tickled me this week. One of them is the reminder that our spiritual traditions teach us to do that. It's called, in the Christian tradition, spiritual discernment. It means that you pay careful attention to what is happening, and you consider it in light of your experience, your beliefs, what you trust, what you hope for, what you understand you have to give, what you understand about what you have been given, spiritual discernment. And the other one is a variation on the word brainstorming. I think this summer we'll have some gatherings where we get to, quote, brainstorm about some things that might be similar to the past, that might be exactly the same, and things that might be different, because we're each bringing new things. But there's another word I heard that I loved even more, and it's called heart-storming. What is coming from our hearts to create this beloved community? What do our hearts lead us to bring, whether it's blue and purple yarn or onyx stones, whether it's acacia wood or something more contemporary? What is it that we bring to build this beloved community? Amen. Well, we have